Avadon 3 Warborn is a turn-based fantasy CRPG by Spiderweb Software. In case you don't know, Jeff Vogel, the main man behind the company, has been making games like this since the early 90s. I've heard a lot about his other games like Avernum and Geneforge, but this is the first Spiderweb game that I've actually played. They sent me a key and I figured it was exactly in my wheelhouse, so I might as well do a video on it. Originally, I planned to play for an hour or two and do a short first impression style video, but I ended up playing the game for about 6 hours straight. At that point, I decided to take some notes and talk about the game in a little more detail, so here goes. When I first launched Avadon 3 Warborn, I was greeted by this main menu. Not only was it not in the right aspect ratio, it wasn't even the right size. There was background music playing that I'd heard in at least 2 other games previously, and I noticed a UI bug with the highlighting of the menu options. None of these is a major game-breaking issue, but each of them belies a lack of polish and a lack of care for the usability of the game. One thing I will say is that the sound options are very poor. There's not even a volume slider. All you get is the ability to switch between off, quiet, or normal. That's not okay. So right off the bat, I was a little disappointed by Avadon. In fact, the usability issues extended to the game itself. Dialogue choices are not highlighted when you hover over them, which again is a minor thing, but it's also such low-hanging fruit. Just change the text color. I mean, this is the worst case of not having a UI designer that I've seen for a long time. The visuals in general are okay as long as the game is not in motion, but the animations and particle effects look a little amateur. For example, the movement speed of your characters is a lot faster than the walk animation implies, so it looks like they're sliding around on the ground. When I got into the game, there was a bit of a tutorial, although it didn't call itself that. There was also a lot of exposition and reading involved before I finally managed to experience any real freedom in terms of the gameplay. In general, the game is a little too wordy for my liking, but it's easy enough to skim the text and move on. After messing around and doing minor tasks in the camp, it was finally time to do my first real mission as a Hand of Avadon. Speaking of which, I should probably explain the story a little bit. You play as a Hand of Avadon, an agent of Avadon, which is an organization made to protect an alliance of nations called the Pact. You operate outside of the law and you take your orders directly from Avadon. There's a war going on between the glorious and wonderful Pact and the filthy Outlander savages. As you might imagine, it's not quite as black and white as that, and the game does a good job of reminding you that Avadon is not all that nice. For the most part, people outside the Pact regard you with great trepidation. Turns out, Hands of Avadon have a habit of getting what they want by any means necessary, which is not to say you have to act like that. You get a choice, and a lot of side quests and mainline quests involve making these types of choices. The kind where you have to weigh your obligation to your nation against your desire to do the right thing. For example, I was exploring a map and discovered an underground path to an island graveyard with a tower built on it. After fighting through lots of undead, I found a necromancer at the top of the tower. Except it turned out that this necromancer was loyal to the Pact. He was creating a horde of undead to use against our enemies in the war. In fact, he was doing this in Outlander territory so that even if things ever got out of hand, our people wouldn't be harmed. On one hand, necromancy is atrocious, but on the other hand, this is actually a pretty clever idea. That example also illustrates another thing I feel Avadon 3 does very well: rewards for exploration. Exploring maps in this game rewards you with enjoyable content. You still get the loot and experience, of course, but you also get to do a fun, self-contained mini-quest that also helps you get a little bit more insight into the story world. The character and loot progression curves in this game are also very well tuned. Upgrades are frequent enough to keep you chasing after the next one, but also not so frequent that they lose meaning. Combat in Avadon 3, however, is interesting. When it comes to turn-based combat, there's always a trade-off between how fast combat can be resolved and how much thought the player has to put into their decisions. Tactics games like XCOM sacrifice speedy resolution or meaningful decision-making, and that's to be expected. That's not always right for RPGs though, which have a lot more going on in the form of quests and exploration. Avadon 3 has features like skills with spatial effects and the possibility of friendly fire, which give the combat the potential for some very interesting decisions, but this doesn't come to fruition too often. It leans much more on the side of letting you slaughter many enemies very quickly. Even on the hard difficulty setting, I found that using basic attacks was enough for a lot of combat encounters. But given the lack of polish, surely a lack of tactical decision-making would result in a combat system that's utterly boring, right? Well, no, not really. And that's for 2 reasons. First, the trash encounters are over quickly enough to not really matter. And second, scripted combat encounters in this game spice things up a lot, and they're used very liberally. One time I was fighting against a group of wolves, and partway through, a little dialogue box popped up to let me know that some other wolves, unseen, had circled around and attacked us from the rear. This sort of thing makes the fights much more exciting for a few reasons. First, it forces you to react and reassess your position in the middle of the fight. Second, the little text blurb adds some flavor and makes the game feel a little more like a fantasy novel. Third, it adds an element of surprise to the battles. Finally, after encountering a few of these, you start to consider them before overcommitting in a battle. You have to ask yourself questions like, what if there's another wave? What if new enemies come out to surround me? These scripted encounters do an amazing job of making the combat in Avadon 3 enjoyable in its own unique way. Moving on, let's talk about the character system. The character options you get are 5 different classes, each with a shared pool of attributes, but 3 unique skill trees. The base attributes don't seem to be very interesting, and I did just fine by investing all my points into the class's main attribute. The skill trees, however, are a little more fun, because in order to level up a skill to a new level, the prerequisite skill must also be of that level or higher. On one hand, this forces you to generalize within the skill tree itself, but also incentivizes choosing one skill tree to specialize in. The fact that learning a new skill costs 2 skill points while upgrading an existing one only costs 1 also encourages a degree of specialization. Upgrading skills to level 3 and 6 also unlocks new functionality and skills, which is pretty cool. Overall, the skills in the game are pretty interesting and range from straight damage buffs to cleaving enemies to moving enemies and allies around in space. Ultimately, I really liked Avadon 3 Warborn. It's just that I was only able to like it because I was able to overlook the roughness and jankiness that never really goes away. The problem is that there are some excellent modern CRPGs that have a much better UI than Avadon 3 and have much better polish than Avadon 3. And I don't know if this game has enough to overcome that. Anyways, if you're interested in this game, it comes out on September 14th on Steam, GOG, and the Humble Store. I'll throw some links down in the video description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!